Hello everyone, Hobbyist here, and we are back at it again with another board game review / tutorial. This time, I'm going to be going a more classic route in comparison to the videos that we've done before. As one of the older games that I have inside of my collection, Catan is a game that is about trading, building, and settling. For a little while now, I'm going to be in a completely different location from where I'm normally used to recording, but that's just what we're going to have to deal with. If you haven't yet already, make sure to hit that like button and to make sure to subscribe as well and to turn on that bell notification icon to get constant updates on whatever reviews or whatever sorts of content that I'll be doing in the near future. But otherwise, let us go ahead and see what Catan is all about. Now, when it comes to Catan, as far as what you actually get inside the box, it's always going to start with the 19 terrain hex tiles, which whenever you initially get them in cardboard punch-outs, but they also supply you in the newer edition with these baggings, so that will be able to store everything better for you. In addition to these 19 hex tiles that you're able to get, you are also going to get 6 C-frames that are going to encompass the rest of your board, and is going to provide an opportunity of various trading opportunities, which we'll get into more a bit later on. On top of that, you will also get 4 building cost tiles, which are your reminder of how it is that you're going to be able to progress. There is one for each color, as in base Catan, there is only enough for 4 players. Got one in blue, one in white, one in red, and one in orange. Now, if you ever so decide that you want to include more people, more people are becoming more interested in Catan, there is a base game expansion to where it will enable you to add that 5th and 6th player, and it will help modify it a little bit if you're looking for something a little bit more. But otherwise, inside of just Catan, you're only going to have enough to play with up to 4 players. On top of all of that, you will also be getting a set of dice, one that is red and one that is yellow. That is going to play a role inside of your game. On top of that, we also have 2 tiles, one that represents the longest road achievement that exists, which I'll explain into greater detail, and we also have the largest army. On top of that, we also have inside of this plastic baggie here, just because I've kept the storage all together, you will get 9 port pieces as well as 19 number tokens, which are going to greatly play a role inside of your game of Catan. Furthermore, we also have 25 development cards, which are also going to play a role to where it might be the thing that greatly increases your chances as far as winning is concerned. With all of that, you also get a robber piece, and he is going to play a role inside of the game and is going to be your sort of obstacle that you are able to utilize against other people. But I'll explain how he works later. We also have, in total, 90, well, at least several pieces that are inside of Catan when it comes to the 16 cities, 20 settlements, and 60 roads altogether, all of which are divided out for each individual color, and it all gets stored inside of this giant bag here. They're all wooden pieces, they're not plastic, so it's definitely something to make things a little bit more interesting when it comes to your Catan experience. Last thing that you will get inside of your components whenever you buy just the base game of Catan is that you will have 95 resource cards altogether. Inside of base Catan, there are a total of 5 different resources that you will be collecting throughout the course of the game. First one that you have is wheat. The second one that you have is ore. The third one that you have is lumber. Fourth one you have is wool. And lastly, you have brick as well. side note, if you are looking to find out what more that you could potentially get with Catan, they also provide you, inside of the newer editions of Catan, a booklet that gives you the idea of how you can further expound upon your Catan experience, to where it'll provide you with the ideas of expansions that you can add. It will provide you with other versions of Catan, whether you're playing with a younger group, whether you want a specific theme, travel on the go, whether it be for games, for merchandise. It's got a whole bunch of promotional material for anyone who is absolutely in love with Catan. And it's also even got its own version of like a pandemic legacy, to where, depending on the expansions that you combine, just for example, the Legend of the Conquerors requires both the base game of Catan and Cities and Knights, whereas Legend of the Sea Robbers requires the Seafarers expansion with base, and then Catan Crop Trust is its own separate thing to where you can play it with just the base game. And each of the individual expansions also come with 5 6-player extensions, but we are going to worry about that more later on, whenever I manage to potentially get a hold of these products, and I'll do separate videos for you guys. But now, let us go ahead and move away from the component overview and go into the setup. Because all of the Catan C pieces are all puzzle boards, they all should fit very nicely to where you get a hole like this. But the next step that you have when it comes to your setup is that, again, you're going to refer to your rulebook and lay out the tiles inside of each of the various areas until they match the picture. So inside of the beginner scenario, once all your tiles are laid out, all of your numbers are going to be arranged as such, and if you want a more up-close look of what this exactly is supposed to look like, consult your rulebook, because it is going to tell you what the beginner scenario looks like. And just as a side note, if you are an experienced player, you've been playing this for a while, and you kind of want to switch it up with a more experienced variation, the biggest difference between the beginner variation and the experienced is the fact that all the tiles are completely shuffled at random and are randomly placed everywhere, and all the number tokens are placed completely random everywhere, with a key rule. No two red numbers can be directly side by side to one another. They all have to be separated, because the biggest difference as far as the number tokens go is that the red numbers are generally considered hotspots. They're going to be the more common rolled statistically inside of a game of Catan in comparison to the rest of the numbers. Every single number token that is on the board from 2 to 12 may or may not have a double, with 2 and 12 being the only single numbers inside a game of Catan, whereas everything else in between is going to have a double. So that is just something to keep in mind in regards to positioning and things of that nature. But moving on forward with the rest of how the setup continues, once everything is played out, you are going to place your robber in the middle of your desert. In every game of Catan ever, the robber is always going to start inside of the desert location. On top of that, you are going to then place on the side of the board all of your resources inside of stack piles. These are going to be the supply for the rest of the game. Inside of a separate pile, you're going to then take your development deck, give it a nice good shuffle, and it's going to be a separate stack with the longest road and the largest army cards sitting next to it. The final step that you are going to do before you have fully completed your setup of what everything that needs to come out of the box first is that each player is going to receive their building cost card, and it is just simply going to sit right in front of them, with each of the various pieces of the settlements, the roads, and the cities going to be sitting in their respective piles that match the building cost color. The key thing, though, that you got to remember is that each color can only have 5 settlements, 4 cities, and 15 roads. They can have no more and no less than that amount. Inside of our physical demonstration, I'm going to be using all 4 colors, but the rules will specifically mention that if you are playing with 3 players instead of 4, then the only position that you will completely ignore is the red position. But otherwise, you are going to then again consult your rule book and place each of the individual colors with one road and one settlement each in those specific locations. Inside of an experienced game, you are going to start from one end, and that person has the ability to pick one settlement and one road and place it anywhere onto the board, meaning that they might be able to take advantage of various hotspots. It is entirely up to them to start their position. And then it works clockwise, to where then blue would get to put a settlement and a road anywhere. Then it would go to white, then red, thus completing the first round. Again, this is all experienced. Inside, if you're still doing the experienced route, then the person who went last gets to go first, so placing their second road and settlement anywhere onto the map. And then it goes from red to white to blue, then orange, and it goes backwards. Inside of an experienced game, you are going to determine your starting resources from that second placement, meaning that wherever you place that first city and settlement isn't going to count. Whereas with the second one, it is going to count. And there is a specific rule when it comes regarding how you are able to place it. And now I'm going to zoom in onto the board to show you what I mean by specific place. Whenever you are choosing a location to place your settlement and your road, there are a couple of terms that you need to be aware of when it comes to Catan. There are intersections and there are edges that are onto the actual board itself. Intersections, of course, are anywhere where 3 tiles meet, and those are the only places that you can place the settlement. So in this current camera shot, if I were blue and I chose to place a settlement or build a settlement in any of these intersection locations, then I could choose to place a settlement right here, right here, right here, or I could do it right here. And that is the locations of where settlements could go. You could also do right here as it intersects with 2 tiles, but it wouldn't necessarily be the best thing as far as your choice goes. Roads only go on the edges. You can't build a road on an intersection. And the most important thing is that roads have to connect to a settlement. So if I chose to put a settlement right there, the road has to connect off of it. It can't just be willy-nilly put over here away from everything. It has to connect to a settlement. And other players, of course, can find their positions too by doing the same thing. Once your beginner setup has been complete and everyone has placed their 2 settlements and 2 roads each, the beginner guide will then show you the white star locations of where your starting resources are going to be coming from. Inside of an experienced player's game, as I mentioned earlier, wherever you place your second settlements, wherever 2 or 3 resources intersect on that second placement is the 3 resources that you start off with. So you want to choose your areas carefully. But now that everyone's got resources, let me now switch to more of a player overview in regards to what they are able to do and some key things to keep in mind whenever you are trying to play Catan. Getting into the real objective of Catan here, what you are trying to do over the course of the game is accumulate 10 points. Super easy when saying it out loud, but it's a little bit more difficult than that. Your building costs are going to tell you how much value each and everything is and what it is going to cost in order to be able to build these things. So, as we can see here, roads cost a lumber and a brick in order to build, but they offer no victory points. whereas settlements offer 1 victory point, cities offer 2 victory points, and development cards can offer an assortment of victory points depending on what it is that you were able to acquire. So there's going to be some reminders as far as how everything is built and the rules on development cards, as far as when you can play them and how many you can play and how many you can buy, the timing of it all. And it's double-sided, it's all the same, so it doesn't really matter which side you have. But when it comes to your resources that you start with, again, inside a beginner, it'll just be 1 resource, but inside of experience, it's always going to be 3 resources. Those resources are kept only to yourself. Nobody is going to see these cards. However, during the game, you are allowed to share with other players, and it is public knowledge that of what the resources are and the quantity of resources that you have. For example, let's say you picked a double wool and a wood as your intersection point. You get those 3 resources. Everybody is allowed to know, I have 2 wool and I have 1 lumber, but they aren't able to know which card are each of those things. You can't lie about what the cards are and the quantity. You can't just point to the location of where they are in your hand, if that makes the most sense. So, over the course of a game, it is going to have 3 phases. This is going to encompass a player's turn. You have a production of resources phase, you have a trading phase, and then you have a building phase. Once each of those is completed, you then move on to the next player's turn. So when it comes to the resource production phase, you are simply going to take 2 dice that you have and simply roll for it. And then you are going to consult the number on the dice, and that tile that has that number is going to produce one of those resources. However, let me get into more specific detail. So the number that I rolled for our resource production was a 12, meaning that the way that resources are determined as far as who gets it and how many are obtained is by the number of settlements that intersect at that location. So for example, we could see that in this current camera shot, that white player is going to receive 1 wheat from that production. If there are more than 1 settlement that is able to be at a intersection that has the same number, let's say that 11 was rolled, then that would mean both white and red would be able to obtain 1 lumber each. If multiple settlements of a particular player are at a location, let's say that white was able to manage to build 3 settlements at the 12 location, then that means that white would get a wheat for each individual settlement that he had built there. If instead of settlements, that there were in fact cities at these locations that were able to produce resources, then for each city, that player receives twice the amount of production in comparison to just the 1 that they would normally receive. So instead of receiving 1 wheat from that location, he would receive 2 because the city was in that location. And just to kind of bring up some numbers, if those 3 settlements that I had shown earlier were all cities, then that player would receive 6 wheat each time that a 12 is rolled. So you can definitely get some resources out of the various buildings that you were able to conjure up based on your resources. Once the dice have been rolled, that concludes the resource production phase, and then we move on to the trading phase. And the way that trading works in Catan is that whoever the current player's turn is, let's say that we were blue and we were the ones who were going to start on this turn. Every other player that isn't blue, white, red, and orange, has the opportunity, based on what resources blue may or may not have, to be able to offer bargains and trades. So where, let's say right now, that orange controls the wheat, and blue might need wheat in order to either build a settlement or upgrade any of its settlements to cities. So then blue could then ask anybody, do they have wheat? If that player has wheat, then they can offer to bargain a 1-for-1 trade, 2-for-1 trade. The amount of trades that can happen during the trading phase can be as unlimited as possible. However, if blue turns down a trade from anybody, he says that no deal is going to happen, your trade's too unfair, I feel you're scamming me out of a trade, and he says no, then that means that every other player has lost the opportunity to trade with that player at the time. So you got to be careful if you're the one that people are trying to play with. If you are trying to just simply see what other players have to offer, rather than that one player that hardly doesn't have anything, or if another player is controlling all of that resource that you need in order to build your settlements or your cities, maybe even get those development cards, then you are simply just waiting for counter offers from other players. But once that has been determined that a trade has occurred, or there has been a decline in the trade, then that simply ends the trading phase. Generally, as the game progresses inside of Catan, it often becomes more difficult to trade with other players. Sometimes players will control all of one resource, and they'll want more from you in order to get any of their supply, because they're the only ones who have it. Or sometimes it might even go as far as to where you have too many of one resource that nobody needs. So you can't get rid of what you have in order to get what you need. This is where maritime trades start to come into play. Now, when it comes to maritime trades, all it simply entails is that if you have a 4 of a kind, or for every 4 of a kind that you have inside of your hand, you can then trade in that entire 4 of a kind back to the supply and get any one resource from the supply in order to give yourself the best chance of doing whatever you need to do inside of the building phase. The biggest thing that sucks about the maritime trade is that you have to give up so much resource for so little in return because of the 4-to-1 ratio. However, this is where all of the seaports that you see across the land of Catan come into play. Because if you have the ability to do a maritime trade, and one of your settlements is at one of these harbors, then you are able to get a discounted rate. If we look towards the bottom here, we could see this question mark ship that's closest to the camera. We can see that it says 3-to-1 with a question mark, meaning that if you are able to build a settlement there, then you have access to get rid of a 3 of a kind of any resource and get one resource from any of them inside of the supply. The specialty item seaport trades, like the wheat to the left or clearly the wood on the right, then those offer discounted rates for trading in those specific resources. Meaning that if you have a settlement at either of those harbor locations, then you are able to then trade 2 wheat that you were able, for every 2 wheat that you were able to trade in, you can get a resource of any kind from the supply and add it to your hand, thus giving you discounts and giving you greater opportunity to take advantage and to progress inside of Catan. If production has been going crazy during the production phase, and somehow any of the 5 resources run out inside of the supply, then whenever that person is producing that resource, they simply just don't get it that turn. The supply is never limited whenever maritime trades do occur, whether they be with maritime straight with the 4 of a kind, or from the seaport trades. But just be careful of what the supply is looking like, so that way you can determine if it is the best opportunity to increase that supply to better increase production for everybody else. But now, the last and final step that we need to look into, past our production phase when we roll the dice, past our trading phase, whether we do it with other players with us, with the maritime trades, with the supply, or if we do it with discount rates at each of the ports, we need to now get into the building phase of Catan. Inside of Catan, we've constantly talked about the building costs as far as what the resources are needed in order to build one of any of these types. So for every wood and lumber pair that you have, you are able to build one road. For every 4 of a kind that isn't ore, you are able to build a settlement. And if you have a 3 of a kind of ore, 2 wheat, you can build a city. Which simply, whenever cities are built, they replace your settlements. And then for every wheat, wool, and ore combination that you have, you are able to draw a development card. So those are each of the individual recipes, but there are a couple of things that you have to keep in mind. In order to build more than one settlement from your initial starting position, you need roads to connect to those settlements in order to build more. And for you to be able to build cities, you need settlements in play. Because cities replace your settlements whenever they are built. And development cards have no limit as far as to how many you can acquire, but you can only ever use one development card during your turn, and you can't ever play the development card on the turn that you get it. So that is just a strategy point that you got to keep in mind. But the other very important thing that is going to determine your position, whether you're doing it as an experienced player or as you're progressing inside of this game, is the distance rule. There's a distance rule needed from both opposing players and for yourself in order to build things and to grow and conjure up the 10 points that you need. If we are looking at blue and red here closest to us, we can see that there is a considerable distance between them. In order for red to successfully be able to build another settlement, he needs 2 distance away from his previous settlement. Meaning that the current spot that is directly in front of blue cannot have another settlement because there is not 2 distance away. And 2, it also means that another settlement can't be built on the opposite side of blue that is closest towards the camera because there isn't another distance between them. Meaning, saying as if there was the distance for orange, this position entails that if orange wanted to build another settlement on that 8 and 5, he could not because of the 2 distance rule between blue and orange. So because there isn't 2 distance, this move here for placing the orange settlement cannot happen. Thus, blue has blocked off that location from orange. This distance rule is completely vital and the most important inside of Catan, because without this distance rule, players could be hogging up corners and kind of being cutthroat. Whereas with the distance rule in play, it allows you to be able to strategize and to find certain resources that you might block off from everybody else to where you can sort of create a monopoly on a resource. Especially on a randomized game, because sometimes, depending on how the tiles shuffle, you might get a lot of the same resource accumulated in one area. And if you control that one resource, then you can offer other players to pay more resources in order to take from your supply. Or you could take advantage of the maritime and port trades in order to get a better ratio with the resources that you will need in order to progress. But now, let's go away from the distance rule and let us kind of look at the development cards a little bit. Give us an idea of why that would be important instead of just building the settlements and upgrading them to cities. Inside of Catan, there are 3 different kinds of development cards that you can potentially get in any particular game. You have progress cards, which are marked by the green, that offer a variety of different abilities in order to help you progress. Hence why they're called progress cards. You also have knight cards, which have the ability to influence the robber, which I will get into detail in just a second. But they also are contributing towards the largest army card. Lastly, we have victory point cards. Now, these victory point cards and all development cards that you are able to gain are kept hidden from all players and can be played at any time during the beginning of your turn. The development cards cannot be played when you buy them, and you can only ever play one development card during your turn. But as far as looking into gathering more points, let's go ahead and take a look at these longest road and largest army cards. Now, for the longest road, you have to have a continuous section of 5 roads with no settlements in between them. If there are settlements built in between the sections, then that cuts off the section and it breaks it up. So where, for example, if we're looking inside of this stack here, if there is a settlement built in between this, then that is simply divided into 4 roads going out and 2 roads, and it's not the 6 roads. And if you are able to complete it, you get 2 victory points added, in addition to the victory point cards that you have and the cities and settlements that you were able to get. The knights that I showed earlier all play a role into the largest army. If you are able to play 3 knights or more, you are able to get 2 victory points. So while it may seem practically impossible to gain points from settlements and cities because resources have been scamming you out or they have gone scarce, you can still find ways to get those maritime and port trades to fulfill the recipe to get development cards in order to obtain victory points through that deck. But now, the last and final thing to Catan, and the most important bit to Catan, is the robber himself. So let us see how he works. Starting in the desert is the robber himself, the mischievous character who can steal resources from other players and cut off production lines from various spaces. The way that the robber is triggered is that whenever a 7 is rolled, there are a couple of things that happen prior to him being moved. The first step would be that whenever a 7 is rolled, you take a look at the number of cards in your hand. If, through resource production and being able to accumulate resources, that any player has 7 or more cards in their hand, they first have to discard half of their resources, rounding down back to the supply. So if you have 20 cards, just for example, then you would have to get rid of 10 cards from your hand. And depending on what resources you have, this could make this easier or more difficult for other kinds of trades. While losing half your hand sucks, that's not the key reason that the robber can be a problem for any plan. The reason is that the robber, the player that rolled a 7, can pick up the robber and move him to any space, any tile that he chooses. If it is a player with if only one player is at an intersection with that tile, then you cover up the number and you randomly take 1 resource from that player. The biggest reason that you are keeping the order of the cards secret from the rest of your players is because keeping that random element of what has been taken is more important. So, for example, if red has a lot of wheat and a lot of ore, then you won't know which card it is because he might shuffle up his hand and then allow you to pick one, but you are picking one from random, to where you might get the resource you need, you might not. And while the robber is moved to that location, anytime that number is rolled on production, the robber blocks it off, meaning that no resources are being conjured from that particular area. If the robber comes to a location where more than one player controls that particular intersection and tile, then that player simply chooses which player he is going to choose to rob. And then, of course, that player can then shuffle the resources in their hand, and then at random, the person robbing that other player gets to choose one card to take for themselves. Once the robbing has been completed, this is simply it. Keep on building, keep on accumulating those resources, upgrade those settlements to cities, use those development cards, and use the robber to do everything you can to control your resources and accumulate those 10 points to victory. And that is simply it. That is how you play Catan. It seems like a lot at first, but when it is all broken down, it's actually quite easy, and it has a lot of replay value. If you guys want me to cover any of the expansions, or any of the extensions inside of Catan, please leave a comment down below. If you watched all the way through, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.